Grace and peace. I'm Brian Musser, the Baptist campus minister at Drexel, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship, the peace of Jesus Christ to change our lives, the power of the Holy Spirit to change the world. And we are continuing our series in the book of Acts, putting the kingdom of God on the map. We're looking at the first 12 chapters of the book of Acts and seeing how the church went from Jerusalem to a worldwide movement. And by the end of Acts, it gets to Rome, but where we're going to be starting or stopping this series, it'll be just kind of beginning to spread into the Gentile world. This is lesson 7. This is the first video of lesson 7. This week we're going to be looking at crossing boundaries, the Acts chapter 8, all the verses 1 through 40, and we're going to be looking at this idea that the gospel will not be contained by those boundaries we have constructed. In this first video, we're checking out the first 8 verses, which have to do with Philip's engagement with the Samaritans. And the main idea is the gospel overcomes ethnic barriers. Now, the gospel overcomes social barriers, economic barriers, all sorts of other barriers, racial, class barriers, everything. Every barrier is knocked down by the gospel. However, this one, in this passage, we're going to be looking at this ethnic barrier, this division between the Jews and the Samaritans, and how the gospel just completely and totally obliterates that barrier between Jews and Samaritans, which was an ancient, old barrier that had been involved in violent conflicts, and even violent conflicts somewhat recently, as we're looking at this story of Philip. Now, this is, if you came to actually the live discussion, either this would be so much more important and appropriate, but just kind of highlighting this. I don't know if you've seen this, but you take 9 dots, put them in this sort of formation of paper, and you have to be able to draw 4 lines without picking up your pencil and connect all 9 dots. Now, what happens is we see those 9 dots and we think of a box. And very seldom will people go outside of the box to draw the lines. Our mind creates a box, and we tend to stay inside of that box. However, to answer this, what you need to do is actually draw the lines outside of the box, and it's very easy once you know that little hint. But our minds create these divisions, our minds create these boxes, our minds create this way that we see it, and we don't do that. Our ethnic boundaries, our racial boundaries, our social boundaries, our economic boundaries, our class boundaries, are just language barriers, all sorts of boundaries that we have drawn. We see those, we feel those, we think those are real, even though there are just constructs that we have made. The gospel obliterates all those boundaries and barriers. The gospel is for every person, everywhere, at all times, regardless of any of those social constructs that we have made to separate us from them. The gospel doesn't care about that. This passage illustrates that. So let's actually look at the text here. This is the first 8 verses of chapter 8. We are continuing from chapter 7. So this first sentence here is about the martyrdom of Stephen that we saw in chapter 7, and we see, and Saul approved of their killing him. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned him deeply, but Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Philip went down to a city in Samaria and proclaimed the Messiah there. When the crowds heard Philip and saw the signs he performed, they all paid close attention to what he said. For with shrieks impure spirits came out of many, and many who were paralyzed or lame were healed. So there was great joy in that city. So that's the story of Philip initially engaging the Samaritans. And just some notes on the text pointing out some things that we can just highlight and talk about. The word scattered there, when it talks about the church being scattered in 8:1 and in 8:4, and there's another reference of it in 11:19, is the Greek word kind of diaspora, which means to scatter seed or to disperse. It literally refers to the scattering of seed, and when it is figuratively used for people, it's used in exile. So it's like how you, and I don't know if you've ever been on a farm, but sometimes when you want to be planting a field and you're working with your hands, you don't have tractors or anything like that, you take seed in your hand and you just kind of scatter it throughout the field trying to get an even thing. You may have done this scattering grass seed on your lawn or wheat in a field or something like that. That action, that scattering of the seed, dispersing the seed in a field, is the word that they use for the disbursement of the church throughout the rest of the empire because of the persecution in Jerusalem that came after the death of Stephen because of the persecution led by Paul, which is interesting to note, and we'll kind of pick that up on one of the questions there. We see Philip, one of the seven, pointed in Acts 6:1-7, like Stephen, preaching and performing signs, these miracles, which is exactly like Jesus, exactly like the apostles, exactly like Stephen. This is the first time we actually see someone casting out demons in Acts, but it was also something said about the apostles and Jesus and Luke. And there's a text that could be the city of Samaria or a city of Samaria. And it's probably is not Samaria itself, which at this time was called Sebaste, because the Romans renamed it. And Sebaste or Samaria was predominantly populated by Greco-Romans and not Samaritans, and we see that Philip is distinctively dealing with Samaritans here. Gita, which is historically known as the hometown of a sorcerer named Simon, or Shechem, the ancient religious capital of Samaria near Mount Gerizim, are more likely locations than the city of Samaria. So it's a city of Samaria. I would vote for Shechem, but some people think it's the Gita because of the connection with Simon, the sorcerer. But anyways, it's this city of Samaritans that Philip goes to and shares the gospel with them and does perform signs and wonders, and the Samaritans turn to Christ in belief in large numbers. Now, this might not be a big deal, but I think a little bit of history of the conflict between the Jews and Samaritans might actually help us here. See, this is sort of Jewish history. They take over the Promised Land about 1400 BCE, and they're a loose confederation of tribes. The 12 tribes kind of relate to each other. Every once in a while, a judge will come up, pull them together to fight against an invader. But except in kind of the defense of the land, they function as individual families and even individual tribes. Then King Saul comes around and he kind of unifies it into one kingdom under Saul, but that unification really, really pulls together under David and Solomon, and Judah. Both are from Judah, and they lead and unite all of Israel under one monarchy. But that only lasts at most for 120 years. So this idea of the nation of Israel being both Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel is only for 120 years, and it happens 1,000 years before the story Luke is describing here in the book of Acts. So about 1,900 years before this, for some, like that far back in history, the northern kingdom of Israel, which is now referred to as Samaria, and Judah, which centers around Jerusalem, were one nation under one king. But then after Solomon, it splits into Judah and Israel, and sometimes they're allies, sometimes they actually are warring against each other. They fight battles, they fight wars. They are two separate neighboring nations that have a very, very complex history. Sometimes they're violently opposed, sometimes they are allies, It just varies from year to year. And they stay that way for about 200 years. So for about 100, 120 years, they're one kingdom. For 200 years, there's two separate kingdoms, sometimes at war, sometimes allies. And then the northern kingdom of Israel is defeated by and conquered by Assyria. And those many of the upper class of that northern kingdom are deported by the Assyrians, and more come in, and the land is repopulated by some of the lower class Israelites in the northern kingdom. The Canaanites are still around, and the Assyrians move in some people. And that's really the historical population that make up the Samaritans. So some of the remnant of the northern tribes of Israel, some Canaanites, and some foreign outsiders brought in by force by the Assyrians and settled in this area. Now, the kingdom of Judah in the southern, which centers around Jerusalem, exists for another 150 years. And they have some interactions with these people in northern Israel, but not so much. They go into exile in Babylon for about 70 years. They come back. They're returned to the land, but still ruled by Persia and Greece. And the northern tribes of Israel, this mixture of interesting people, Israelites, Canaanites, and foreigners, are ruled by Persia and Greece as well. But they're two kind of separate, and they're sometimes the kingdom of Judah has some dealings with the people in northern Israel. Sometimes they don't. They really don't have any political power to fight one another, but they're neighbors being ruled by the same Persian and Greeks, but they're two separate entities. And then Judah has a rebellion against the Greeks and are able to create their own kingdom under the Hasmoneans. And those Hasmoneans actually fight with the Samaritans and the northern tribe of Israel and conquer them and actually destroy their temple. Now, eventually both those places are conquered by Rome, and ultimately Jerusalem is definitively destroyed in 70 CE or AD, depending on how you want to label your years. So for 120 years, they're one kingdom. But for 1,000 years, there are two separate kingdoms with two very different political interests. Sometimes they're allied. Sometimes they are at war with each other. Sometimes they are just being conquered by the same person and really don't have any political power to care about anybody else besides themselves. So with that said, the Samaritans in this northern tribe, distinct from the Jews, they have a separate Pentateuch. It's a somewhat different version of the first 5 books from what the Jews have in Jerusalem, and they don't believe in the writings of the prophets or the other Old Testament books of poetry and wisdom, because they were not written when the Samaritans kind of diverged from, historically and politically diverged from Jerusalem. They claim that the Jews who returned from Babylon, the Babylonian exile, returned with a corrupted version of the Jewish religion and the Torah. Now, the Jews who returned believe that the Samaritans were corrupted by their intermarriage with the Canaanites and those foreigners that were the Assyrians repopulated the land with. The Samaritans believe in only one future prophet, which is the Tahib, which is a messianic figure. They get that reference from Deuteronomy. They also believe that the place God chose for worship was Mount Gerizim near Shechem and not Jerusalem. You can see Deuteronomy for those references as well. And in approximately 110 BCE, the Hasmoneans from Judah conquered the area of Samaria and destroyed Shechem and the temple of Gerizim. So these are some of the historical context. So these are two historically kind of warring nations that have parallel histories that intersect quite often, but they intersect more often in conflict than in cooperation. And that's who Philip is sharing the gospel with. He's sharing the gospel with these people who have a different version of the Torah, have a different idea of who the Messiah is, have a different place to worship than the temple, have a different writing of the history of the very same area. They are geographically close to them, but religiously different, theologically different, socially and culturally different. The Jews look down on the Samaritans, but the Samaritans see the Jews as just distinct from them as well. So there is ethnic boundaries here, there's social boundaries, there's religious boundaries, theological boundaries. And Philip goes to them, shares the gospel with them. They hear the story of Jesus, connected actually probably with their messianic figure, the Tahib, and the fact that they have some reference to the Torah, and they come to Christ because of the gospel and the miracles being supported with it as well. We see that as well. So some questions to think about with this. Why are seeds scattered? Seeds are scattered to grow. So the church, using that word for the dispersion of the church, for sending the church about, is a very interesting word to. So the church was scattered in order for the church to grow. Might be a very interesting thing. Who would be comparable to the Samaritans in our context? Who are culturally and or geographically adjacent to us, but socially despised? Who are religiously similar, but theologically distinct? Some interesting questions to ponder. Would love to hear your comments on it. Drop down in the comment section and let me know what you're thinking about these. Enjoyed this conversation. Hope it continues real soon. It can continue in 3 ways: in person Sunday nights at 5 p.m., live Monday nights 7 p.m., weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and WordPress. There is an online calendar at peaceandpower@drexel.com, .wordpress.com. You can find me on social media: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, YouTube. Like, subscribe, follow if you enjoyed in this, and engage me on social media if you want to continue the conversation. Love talking to you. Hope it continues real soon.